You walk through the narrow alleyway, the dim light from the street barely reaching the walls that seem to close in around you. The air is cold and thick with a silence that presses against your ears. The only sound is the steady tapping of your footsteps against the cracked pavement. And then you see her. At the end of the alleyway, barely illuminated by the flickering of an old lantern, stands a woman. Her long black hair spills down over her face, obscuring her features. But you can still feel her gaze locked onto you. She's wearing a white kimono, the kind you've seen in pictures from old funerals. It flutters slightly, though there's no wind. Your breath catches in your throat as you stop, instinctively backing away. But she doesn't move. She just stands there, unnervingly still, as though she's been waiting for you, waiting for anyone. You swallow, your heart pounding in your chest. There's an urge to speak, to ask her who she is, why she's there, but the words die in your throat. Somehow, you know she won't answer. There's a silence about her that feels heavy, final. And then, slowly, she lifts her head, just enough for you to see her mouth, a thin, bloodless line that seems to stretch far too wide, splitting her face into something grotesque, something wrong. Without a sound, she starts to move toward you. Each step is agonizingly slow and deliberate. Her bare feet don't make a sound on the pavement, yet the echo of her approach rings in your ears, louder than your own heartbeat. You try to move, but your feet are rooted to the ground. Every instinct screams at you to run, but you are frozen, paralyzed by her silent approach. Her head tilts slightly as she draws closer, and you realize something horrifying. There are no eyes behind that curtain of hair, only dark, empty sockets that drink in the light. She's close now, close enough that you can feel the chill radiating from her, colder than the night air. Her hand lifts, pale and delicate, reaching for your throat, and as her fingers brush your skin, you feel it. Not pain, but a suffocating silence. A void swallowing every sound, every thought. You want to scream, but there's nothing. Just silence and her. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we delve deep into folklore, myths and supernatural stories of women from all over the world. Today I am very excited because we're going somewhere new. We are taking a little trip to Japan. Another, like I said, new place for us to go. Although I think we've been somewhere new in every episode, so that's probably not the flex that I think it is. But I am very excited, so in the spirit of spooky season, we're diving into the eerie legend of Kuwazu Nyobo, also known as the wife who does not eat. She's a mysterious figure in Japanese folklore, with origins tied to traditional views on marriage, gender, and ghostly tales. We'll uncover her roots, explore the myths that she's appeared in, trace her evolution through history, and talk about how she's transformed in modern culture. Now, Japanese culture is absolutely full of incredible tales of female ghosts and spirits, and I uncovered quite a lot of them doing the research for this episode, so do let me know if you fancy hearing me talk about more of them. And while we're here, if you're enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you're the first to know when a new episode comes out. Now, if you're ready, grab a little drink. I've got a cup of tea on that wonderful coaster that I'll never stop banging on about, and maybe a little snack. And let's jump into the story of Kuwazu Nyobo. To understand the legend of Kuwazu Nyobo, we have to go back centuries. All the way back to a time when Japanese folk stories and ghostly tales reflected deep cultural beliefs about women, marriage, and the unseen. The origin of the specific myth I'm going to tell you is quite vague, but it's rooted in anxieties about the role of wives within the household, all of their unspoken desires and the fear that someone could harbour a dark secret. Stories featuring Kuwazu Nyobo began to emerge in Edo period literature, where Japan was undergoing rapid societal changes. Some even interpret the myth as a reflection of the anxiety men felt about marrying strangers, given that arranged marriages were the norm of this period. And these anxieties combined with Japanese folktales, where female spirits often take on human forms that reflect the ideal Japanese woman. Usually they are beautiful, quiet, perceptive, hardworking and devoted to their husbands. The people around these women are often exploitative of her, take advantage of this good nature and force her to reveal her true form, which is often quite the opposite of the ideal woman. And it's in these moments where the spirits choose to attack and seek revenge on those who have wronged her. The term Kuwazu Nyobo comes from Japanese folklore and refers to a wife who mysteriously never eats. It's a popular motif in Japanese ghost stories, often depicting a woman who seems normal enough at first, but later reveals a supernatural or eerie nature. And when I tell you the story of Kuwazu Nyobo, you'll see exactly what I mean by that. And these legends often served as cautionary tales about appearances being deceiving, as well as the importance of really understanding the nature of the people closest to you. In some versions of the tale, Kuwazu Nyobo is associated with an oni, a demon or ogre-like creature, or some kind of other supernatural being. And the folklore varies, but one interpretation suggests that the wife might actually be an oni. Others say that she may be a yokai, a supernatural creature, and some just a ghost in disguise. In Japanese folklore, oni and yokai are two types of supernatural entities that play significant roles in traditional stories, myths, and cultural beliefs. While they both belong to the realm of the supernatural, they do have distinct characteristics and associations. I won't go into massive detail about them, but I'll give you a very brief overview of them and their differences. So oni are more specifically considered demon or ogre-like entities, typically with a fearsome and malevolent nature. Yokai, on the other hand, include a vast range of supernatural beings, and not all of them are evil. And while oni are often antagonistic, yokai are actually quite neutral, sometimes even helpful, maybe a bit mysterious or dangerous, really depends on the story. And oni have a more consistent portrayal as large, horned, ogre-like figures, while yokai come in many different forms, from animals to ghosts and bizarre hybrids, and that's definitely more like the figure of Kuwazu Nyobo, although she has been described as both. So, while Kuwazu Nyobo is not always explicitly identified as an oni woman in every tale, she often has supernatural or eerie qualities that link her to the world of demons, and it's the same with the yokai. Both oni and yokai are essential parts of Japanese mythology, and they continue to influence popular culture, literature, and art in Japan, even today. So now I've filled your brain with a little bit of cultural context and a little bit about the Oni and the yokai. Let's tell you the story of Kuwazu Nyobo. So it's important to note again that there are several versions of the story, and I'm going to tell you the one that I like the most. But you can hop online and find various different tales of Kuwazu Nyobo, but all kind of have the same basic premise. Each telling of the myth focuses on different aspects of human relationships, or deception, and fear of the unknown. What unites all of these stories, though, is that eerie atmosphere and the growing tension that something is deeply wrong. So here goes the story. Once upon a time, an unmarried man went into the hills to cut wood. He said to his companion that he wished he had a wife who didn't eat. 4 or 5 days later, a woman came to his house and asked him to marry her because she didn't eat. Once they were married, she certainly did not eat. But after she came, the rice and bean paste was disappearing. The man thought this was strange, so one day he pretended to set out for town. But he took the time his wife went to the privy to climb into the rafters of the stable to hide. He watched as his wife took the kettle that contained rice and cooked it. Next, she took the bean paste and made soup. She covered a straw mat with rows of rice balls and put the soup in a bucket to cool. Then she took her hair down, and on top of her head was another mouth. She tossed the rice balls into it and then poured in the bean soup. When she had finished, she combed her hair once more to look as usual. While she was putting things back in order, the man climbed down carefully and pretended to have returned and went into the house. The next morning he said he would send her home. She asked him for something as a gift. He told her to take a tub that was there. She said there were bugs in the tub and asked him to take them out. But she fooled him, and as he leant over to remove the bugs, she pushed him into the tub. She swung the tub up onto her shoulders and ran with it back to the mountains. She called, "I've brought something good to eat, so everybody come." Voices replied from the trees here and there, and the man felt more dead than alive. Branches of trees beside the path brushed the tub as she went along. The man caught onto one and pulled himself out. He started to run back down the mountain as fast as he could. The woman carried on until she came to where everybody was waiting and set the tub down. And she saw the tub was empty and concluded he had ran away. She started after him. When she was about to catch up with him, the man hid where mugwort and iris were growing. She followed, but when she saw him there, she declared her hands would rot if she put them among the plants. There was nothing she could do, so she went back up the mountain. The man had been saved from danger. He put iris and mugwort onto his head and stuck some into his belt and went home. He put the plant onto his roof and at the entrance too, so she could never come again. And that's the story of the terrifying Kuwazu Nyobo. Every time I read this, the one image that sticks in my head is the wife just throwing the balls of rice into the mouth on her head, and I just think, wouldn't it be kind of fun to try and get them in there? Like, you know when you throw like Maltesers in the air and you catch them in your mouth, it's kind of like that, but except the mouth's actually on your head. Maybe I'm childish, but I find that image, it's like a little game, isn't it? But on a serious note, there are some incredible paintings and drawings of this, and I will put some links in the show notes as per usual for you to have a little look at, because they are quite terrifying. So Kuwazu Nyobo appears to be the ideal woman in many ways. Silent, dutiful, hauntingly mysterious though. What's striking is that she refuses to eat, a behaviour that goes against the fundamental acts of life and sustenance. This refusal to consume food is usually what tips people off that something a little bit supernatural might be happening. Traditionally, eating together in Japan has been seen as a way to bond and to share life, so her refusal becomes a metaphor for something very ominous. And as I said earlier, there are many versions of the story. In some variations, Kuwazu Nyobo is not really malevolent, but represents a tragic figure. In these versions, she's a ghost who has returned to fulfill some unspoken duty or desire. Her refusal to eat could be seen as a form of self-punishment, or even a sign that she's already dead. Whatever the way she's shown, these ghostly wives always serve to highlight the thin line between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a recurring theme in Japanese folklore. Like many myths, as Japanese society changed, the story of Kuwazu Nyobo transformed. When it first emerged during the Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1868, Japan was under a strict policy of national isolation, sakoku, which limited foreign influence and promoted the growth of a unique and vibrant domestic culture. And it did bring peace to Japan. And with this relative peace brought by the shogunate, arts and culture flourished. Kabuki theatre, woodblock prints, even haiku poetry and tea ceremonies became popular in this time period. Education spread and literacy increased, leading to more of a demand for literature, including stories and folk tales and guidebooks. And the Edo period also saw a resurgence of interest in Japanese mythology and folklore. So while traditional beliefs were maintained, new stories emerged and older tales were adapted and widely circulated, like they never had been before. This era significantly shaped the portrayal of the yokai and the oni that I mentioned earlier, and all of the supernatural beings in Japanese culture. Yokai were featured heavily in the woodblock prints, in the kabuki plays, and illustrated books called kuzusoji, which were kind of illustrated fiction. And the diversity of yokai expanded, with new stories and creatures being introduced or adapted from older folklore, and stories carrying moral or cautionary messages emerged even more, often reflecting the societal concerns and fears of the time, a little bit like what I mentioned earlier. As Japan modernised during the Meiji period, from the mid-1800s, Western influence crept in and had an impact on mythology and folklore in general. With some traditional beliefs persisting, the period also saw efforts to adapt and reinterpret these stories in the context of a more rapidly changing society. Japan was opening up to the West, and with that brought Western literary styles, and fairy tales and ghost stories became even more popular. And this cultural exchange with the West influenced Japanese writers to reinterpret some of the traditional stories, or to weave the Western themes into them. For instance, classic European fairy tales were often translated into Japanese, and more traditional folk tales got a bit of an update to reflect more modern themes. And this influence of Western civilization and Western rationalism meant that belief in the yokai and supernatural beings as actual literal entities began to decline, particularly in more urban areas. But these beings found a new role as cultural symbols and subjects of entertainment. Yokai stories were increasingly portrayed in a more fictionalized and artistic context, appearing in literature, again in kabuki theatre, and later manga and early film, a little bit different to the more serious portrayals in the previous Edo period. So, in this changing mythological landscape, the tale of Kuwazu Nyobo began to take on new meanings, where the supernatural elements were often the focus of the earlier period. As time went on, these elements were kind of toned down somewhat, and the focus was more on social themes, The tale began to take on a tone that emphasized the social dynamics of marriage and domestic life. Stories of Kuwazu Nyobo during this time might frame the narrative as more of a commentary on the hidden aspects of people's lives, or the challenges of understanding one's spouse, moving away from purely supernatural explanations. In the early 19th and 20th century, the character of Kuwazu Nyobo was featured in rakugo, which is a form of Japanese comedic storytelling. In these retellings, she was often portrayed with a mix of horror and dark humour, emphasising both the absurdity of a wife who just doesn't eat and the underlying fears about hidden identities in relationships. And even in modern pop culture, Kuwazu Nyobo continues to appear time and time again, often symbolising tension between tradition and modernity. Her image has been adapted into films, anime, and manga, where her eerie presence serves as a powerful metaphor. With the arrival of modern Japanese horror in the 20th century, Kuwazu Nyobo continued to evolve again, especially during the J-horror boom of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And if you've seen any of these Japanese horror movies, you'll know they are terrifying. They are so scary. I'm not really a horror film person, but I have seen a few, and yeah, terrifying. Not for me, but it might be for some of you. But this was a time when filmmakers and writers were blending traditional folklore with new kinds of psychological horror, and Kuwazu Nyobo's refusal to eat and her secret ghostly nature became a metaphor again, this time for emotional distance and repression and hidden traumas for families. Again, we see this idea of a wife who doesn't eat becoming even less about literal supernatural beings and more about alienation and the fear of intimacy. And the tale of Kuwazu Nyobo has even more influence over Japanese horror, in the form of the silent wife. Now, the silent wife is actually a reoccurring character in Japanese horror movies, and she's often used to evoke a blend of traditional gender roles and to create a psychological sense of unease. These silent wives tend to symbolise deeper, unsettling themes in Japanese society, again, like repression and loss of identity, and the haunting nature of domestic spaces. Silent wives in Japanese horror are often depicted as women who are emotionally repressed or passive, conforming to traditional expectations of female roles in marriage. They may rarely speak or express themselves openly, symbolising this stifling nature of the patriarchy, or the suppression of individual identity within the institution of marriage. So it's not a literal not eating food like in the original story, it's more of this symbolic repression of other aspects of themselves. They're starved of their identity. And these characters often frequently harbour really deep unspoken traumas or unacknowledged anger, and that's often tied to their marital or domestic life. And this internal tension often becomes the source of the horror when the silent wife transforms, either physically or psychologically, and becomes something menacing or ghostly. The idea of this seemingly docile woman hiding a suppressed rage taps into the theme of onryo, or vengeful spirit, a powerful figure in Japanese folklore. And because the silent wife is often tied to these domestic settings and marriage, Japanese horror frequently uses traditional homes with tatami floors and sliding doors and dim lighting as a claustrophobic, haunting space where the wife's silence becomes ominous. She may be physically present, but emotionally neglected or marginalised, and her silence can symbolise a lack of agency. In horror films, this often becomes literalised, with the wife's silence masking some deep-seated horror, like a tragic backstory or a supernatural curse. There are some absolutely fantastic Japanese horror films which I'm sure that many of you will know, but you might not have known that they're examples of these silent wives and that it's been influenced by the story of Kuwazu Nyobo. Movies like Ju-on or The Grudge feature one of the most iconic silent wives in Japanese horror, Kayako, After her violent death at the hands of her husband, she becomes a vengeful ghost. Kayako's eerie silence in the film is central to her character, as her haunting presence is marked by that voiceless, crawling figure and that awful croaking sound that signals her arrival. And we've all tried to do that noise, haven't we? Don't worry, I'm not going to try and attempt that now, but we all know what the noise from The Grudge sounds like. And I'm sure some of you have just tried to make that noise now, so if you did that successfully, well done. Let me know in the comments. Another one that you've probably heard of, or maybe even seen crawling out of a TV near you, is Sadako from The Ring, or Ringu. Though not a wife, Sadako's ghostly presence embodies the same characteristics of a silent and repressed, rageful wife. In life, Sadako was misunderstood and neglected, had these psychic abilities that eventually got her killed and thrown into a well. Her ghost silently seeks revenge, her rage manifesting in that cursed videotape. Her silence is deafening and creates a terrifying aura around her character. So that's two really iconic things in horror movies. Like, I'm not much of a horror movie buff, as I've said before, but if you asked me to tell you about horror movies, I would probably attempt to do the voice from The Grudge and talk about the girl that crawls out of the TV. So the level of influence that Kuwazu Nyobo has had on Japanese filmmaking is quite insane. And there are many more that I could name, but these are probably the most well known to a more Western audience. And as I said earlier, if you're into horror, I really do recommend checking out more of the J-horror movies, because they are really very, very scary. And I think a big reason for this is that Japanese horror excels at using psychological horror, and the silence plays a big part in this. And what's more scary than silence? And other than film, Kuwazu Nyobo also appears in manga, where she serves as a rich source of inspiration, blending mystery and romance and the supernatural. The tale's exploration of hidden truths in relationships and curiosity and fear of the unknown continues to resonate, making it a popular theme in various manga genres, from horror to romance. For instance, the collection of ghost stories, Kwaidan, includes a version of Kuwazu Nyobo, and this manga explores traditional Japanese ghost stories with eerie and supernatural elements. There's also Let's Dance with Ghost Stories, Then You Won't Return, another manga which incorporates many ghost stories and supernatural beings, including Kuwazu Nyobo, with creepy atmospheric visuals that play on the unease of hidden secrets. In fact, many manga anthologies that adapt Japanese folktales include the Kuwazu Nyobo story, and these adaptations often stick quite closely to that original tale from the Edo period, maybe with slight variations in setting or tone. For instance, some might take the story and place it in modern times, but keep that core supernatural mystery intact. Even in video games, the haunting figure of Kuwazu Nyobo crops up as an archetype of the mysterious secret-keeping woman. Her presence here reflects both the fascination of fear of the unknown that is hidden behind domesticity and everyday life. A great example of this is the Nioh game of 2017, where she makes an appearance in one of the missions entitled The Silent Raven, where there is a yokai resembling the spirit from the tale. And I know you didn't think that I would get to the end of this podcast without talking about the feminist implications of this story and how a modern feminist society might react to some of the themes that we've spoken about. From a feminist perspective, Kuwazu Nyobo reflects the tension between societal expectations of women and the reality of their desires and their autonomy. The folktale can be viewed as a critique on how women are often expected to suppress their own needs to conform to the idealized versions of femininity, and how these expectations are often quite unrealistic, and they can result in the othering or demonization of women when they fail to conform. Through a feminist lens, the perfection that's expected of Japanese women is ultimately unsustainable and deceptive. The husband in the tale's idealization of a wife who is quote, low maintenance and almost unrealistically perfect, mirrors the way women's roles have often been idealised in patriarchal systems where their worth is measured by how little they demand. And it also has a comment on body and appetite control and this lack of bodily autonomy and control over your own self as a woman. We live in a society even now, in many cultures, where a woman's relationship with food and her appearance and her consumption habits have been tied to her value as a wife or even just as a human being. And feminist scholars often discuss how controlling women's appetites, whether for food, power, or sex, has been a way to control, ultimately, their freedom. And the yokai wife's ultimate supernatural nature might actually symbolise a deep fear of what might happen when a woman's true desires or autonomy are unleashed. And that leads to the demonisation of women's autonomy. The transformation of the wife into a yokai is another significant feminist aspect of the story. It reflects how women's autonomy has been completely demonised throughout history and every culture. The fact that this wife is not just a woman but a demon reveals this cultural anxiety surrounding women who are not understood or who conceal their true nature. So I guess in this way, the yokai wife could be seen as a metaphor for female rebellion. Her deception is less about malicious intent and more about the inevitable fallout when women are forced to suppress their true identities in order to conform. And ultimately, the wife in the tale escapes or is banished after her true nature is revealed. And these endings suggest that women who defy societal norms or refuse to be controlled by male desires are cast out or labelled as dangerous. From a feminist angle, the yokai wife's departure represents almost a reclaiming of her autonomy, even though it's framed as monstrous in the context of the folktale. And when you think about it, especially from a woman's perspective, it really is about this woman being perfect, being exactly as her husband wants her to be, not eating. And that could be in a literal sense because he wants her to look a certain way, or it could be in a more metaphorical way. And that's the same as when we were talking about the movies, it's this metaphorical not getting what you desire, not eating the fruits of your labour, not enjoying your life, not being you, not having your freedom or your autonomy. So I think in this way, Kuwazu Nyobo is so fascinating and such a symbol of the patriarchy and of patriarchal marriages. And yes, it's quite a short story, and a lot of what we've talked about today has been movies and different time periods in Japan, but isn't it interesting to think that even back in the Edo period of Japan, and most likely before that, there were women who were just not satisfied with what they had. They weren't satisfied with this patriarchal society. And aren't we lucky that we live in a time where we have come a fair way? We've got a long way to go, don't get me wrong, but we've come quite a fair way from then. I just think women are really cool, to be honest. I love women. I think we rock. I think we deserve to have all the autonomy we seek. And if we're not given it, I think we should have permission to open the mouths in the back of our heads, throw a couple of rice balls into it, and then scare all the men away. And I think we'd be fine. From a haunting figure in ancient folklore to a recurring symbol in modern horror, Kuwazu Nyobo continues to captivate and unsettle us. Her presence in stories reflects timeless anxieties about marriage, trust, and the hidden parts of ourselves we fear to reveal. Whether seen as a literal ghost or a metaphor for emotional alienation, the myth of Kuwazu Nyobo continues to evolve, leaving her silent but powerful legacy in both traditional and modern Japanese storytelling. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ladies of Lore. I hope you've really enjoyed it. If you have, as always, please do leave me a little comment and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really, really enjoyed it, let somebody know about the podcast. The more people you tell, the more people get to hear it. And it makes me feel nice when I get one more follower. I won't lie to you. It puts a little smile on my face every single time. So I really appreciate you joining me for another episode. And I can't wait to bring another one to you next week, where we unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.